Good evening, and thank you for virtually being here tonight. The Mansfield Public Library is excited to virtually host author Caroline Ailanthus for a discussion of her book, Ecological Memory. Caroline is primarily a science writer. Her fiction blends science and story, and she's also the author of the Climate in Emergency blog. Ecological Memory is her second published novel. She grew up in Delaware and attended various small, odd schools, mostly in New England, earning a BA in environmental leadership and an MS in environmental studies. She lives in Maryland with her husband and assorted animals. Please welcome Caroline.
Thank you. Before we get started, just sort of a mini programming note of my own. As I'm having technical difficulties on this side, so getting to the selections I want to read will take, some number of seconds longer than it should. So I've got things under control. Just it's what's happening.
No worries.
Okay, good. So yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for letting me be here. I like doing these. We're here to discuss ecological memory. Usually I have a paper copy with me right here. Technical difficulties. Anyway, so I wrote this book about loss and resilience in the aftermath of a terrible global pandemic. And you know what happened a couple of months after I published this thing? We started a terrible global pandemic. Not quite to the same extent as the one that I'd written about, but still. So that it ended up giving me the opportunity to compare my fiction to real life in a way I had never expected to be able to do. So I want to talk to you about that, both from the perspective of writing craft and also from, world building and that kind of thing. I will start out by reading first page or two for you to kind of get you in the mood of the book. What's it like having hair growing out of your face? Elzy asked as she watched her ecology professor shave in the shade of a hemlock grove. He paused and looked at her. You have hair growing out of your face, he said. You should know what it's like. Elzy's cheeks grew hot and she looked away. She was sensitive about her few chin hairs. But Andy didn't insult and he rarely teased. He probably just meant her eyebrows. She turned back and watched him shave again. He let her watch, ignoring her gaze, as distant and professional as if they sat in his classroom back on campus. She felt safe with him. She didn't know why. She never played the little kid except with him, but she couldn't tell if he liked or merely tolerated the act. Without his white stubble, he looked younger, but Elzy could not guess his age. Personally, he remained a mysterious blank. Professionally, she knew he was impressive. Andrew Cote was one of the few scientists left from before the pandemic. Unlike a lot of survivors, he hadn't left his old career behind. Instead, he and a very few colleagues had fought to save data and scientific literature from failing computers, and then spent years reweaving professional networks and academic systems. 20 years later, he was still at it, crisscrossing the country on foot every summer. She planned to be an environmental educator, not a researcher, but she'd asked him to sponsor her application to the professional guilds anyway. Nobody knew more than he did about how science functioned as a human community, and nobody was better than him at explaining how to work with people. That, and she admired his simple, fearless doggedness. Everything else was a matter of rumor. People said he'd lost a wife and children in the pandemic, but of course a lot of people had. It was his refusal to discuss his family that lifted common tragedy to mythic status. Opinions split over whether he had remarried. Elzy had noticed, traveling with him, that he recorded video messages to someone every night on his little tablet computer. He didn't know she knew. She had overheard him once, just the tone of his voice, soft and gentle, and she had resolved never to overhear again. She'd defend him from anyone, if necessary, even from her own curiosity. She never asked him if the rumors were true. She did once ask him to explain what 10% survival really meant in human terms. Andy had knelt beside her and asked her to put out her hands. She'd laid them, all 10 fingers, on the cool brown needles of the forest floor. The man drew his pocket knife and brought it down hard on her left pinky. Of course, he didn't cut her, but it took all her will not to flinch. He repeated the motion with each of her other fingers, and each time she felt a thrill of fear and the impression of the knife blade lingering on her skin. When he had mimed cutting off all her fingers but one, he folded away his knife and caught up that one surviving finger, her right pinky, in his own warm hand and gave it a friendly little shake. "Now live the rest of your life like this," he'd said. Obviously, their pandemic is worse than ours. Theirs destroys civilization, something ours has never seriously threatened to do. There are other differences. Sorry, there's a typo in my notes here. Forgot I hadn't cleaned that up. The best way for me to explain what their pandemic is like is to let Andy explain it. I should say the reason they're sharing a room here in this scene is that it's the only room left in the inn where they're staying. The excerpt is fairly long, but I'm going to read all of it because it includes some character development and world building stuff too. So it will give you more of an idea of the book as a whole. This left Elzy and Andy nothing to do but retreat to their single room. Elzy wasn't especially attracted to Andy. She assumed he reciprocated her non-interest, but she couldn't ask him. He was her teacher, and he was most likely married, and he was some unknown number of years too old for her anyway. The subject was effectively closed. The sense of the forbidden, plus not actually knowing for sure, gave the whole situation an ambiguity that could have been sexy and exciting with the right person, but with Andy, it was just awful. In the dark, she could hear him shifting around in bed. He seemed uncomfortable with the arrangement too. She wanted to do something to reassure him, to dial back the ambiguity at least a little bit. "Tell me a story," she said in her little girl's voice. "I don't know any stories," he confessed. "I used to have to read to my daughter instead." "I couldn't make anything up." "That's okay." "I don't know any stories except my own." "That's the one I want to hear." "It's not a great bedtime story." "Tell it to me anyway." And this time, to her surprise, he did. Andy had indeed been uncomfortable. He knew there were men in his position who would take advantage, and he didn't like to think that Elzy might fear him. But he felt no ambiguity, no attraction. She was just too young. If Sarah were still alive, she'd be about the same age. He'd been thinking of Sarah, not his living daughter, when he'd spoken of reading just now. He did not ask himself why. And so, when the girl asked, he gave in without thought, without caution, and gave her a bedtime story. The first thing that came to his mind was the scent of the desert, The Sonoran Desert doesn't smell like anything else. It doesn't smell like a beach, although the soil is often sandy, nor is the scent exactly explained by its mix of plants, although they do contribute. If it rains anywhere within miles, you can smell the creosote bushes come alive. A scent like eastern hemlock grove, only more so, flows along most watercourses, the perfume of invasive tamarisk trees. The cloying aroma of desert willow could distract a hiker in April. But underneath all that is something else, something delicate. Andy thought it might be the local mix of soil bacteria, but whatever it was, 20 years later, when he cast his memory back, that scent was the first thing to greet him. When the pandemic came, he began, I was out west in the desert working. I got the news online. How could you get online in the middle of the desert? There were a lot of people back then. So there were cell phone towers everywhere. We had almost universal coverage there at the end. Wow. Okay, go on. So on the news, there was just something about some measles cases in New York. Measles was rare, but not unheard of, no big deal. The strange thing was, a few days later, they said those people had already been vaccinated. The vaccine hadn't protected them. So the pandemic was measles? No one told me that before. When Elzy spoke, he saw their small, darkened room around him. When he replied, he was back in the desert. The shift was jarring. He let himself slip back into his story again. No, see, that's the thing. Measles isn't like the flu, where you need a new vaccine for every strain. With measles, the part of the virus that triggers the immune response doesn't mutate. If you're resistant to one strain, you're resistant to all of them, or it isn't measles. This wasn't measles. The symptoms were similar, but not identical. The big difference was that with the pandemic, pneumonia wasn't just a rare complication. It was an inherent part of the disease. That's why so many people died. They came up with a name for the thing, some acronym, but it never caught on. We called it the pandemic, same as now. Anyway, a few days after that, they said the same thing, a measles-like pneumonia was spreading in other cities around the world. London, Melbourne, Sao Paulo, there were a lot of places. But it wasn't that the other cities had caught it from New York. As far as anyone could tell, they'd actually all gotten it at the same time. It just took a week or so for somebody to realize the news stories in different countries matched. Wait, multiple cities all at once? Was this thing on purpose? Yeah, probably, but nobody ever proved it. Nobody even settled on a really good motive. The people who did it are probably all dead by now. That's horrible. Yeah, I know. It's a horrible story. You want me to tell it? Yes, please. Sorry. The thing is, only a few dozen people were even sick yet. We'd had pandemic scares before, but they never really amounted to anything. As weird as this one was, I figured the public health people would just take care of it. Civilization seemed really remote to me that winter, and I had a lot to do. I had to map out potential bat roosts and nectar sources so I'd know where to put my interns during the spring migration. But I didn't know that they were underestimating the scope of the disease. The public health services, I mean. A lot of people were misdiagnosed who just never sought help. And for the first week, there was no obvious symptoms. You just felt tired. But you were already contagious. So however many people the CDC thought were sick, there were always many more. When the authorities tried to contain the disease, it was already outside the container. We never had a chance. But we didn't know, so I just kept doing my job. When I went into town for another month or so of groceries, I noticed people were freaking out, but they always did that with pandemic scares. So I ignored it and went back out. But then when my wife called me, she said the mystery disease, the pandemic, she said it was in Boston. It was in a lot of cities by then, Chicago, LA, Dallas, anywhere with a major airport. But we were in Keene, right near Boston, and there were little satellite infections springing up in smaller cities and towns all over. Everywhere they screened, they found the pandemic already there. But she didn't call to tell me that. She assumed I already knew. She called to tell me not to worry about her, that she and the kids were fine, that I should stay out in the desert like a reverse quarantine for as long as I could, so I wouldn't get infected. She'd heard the disease was in Tucson, right near me. She wanted me to stay safe. What did you say? I said, F that. What do you think I'd say? I wasn't going to let my family face this thing without me. So I packed up my stuff and drove to Phoenix. I was going to catch a plane, get back east. But I got to Phoenix and there were no planes. They just imposed a travel ban that day, a few hours before I got there. The airport was full of people. They still had planes landing, but nobody was allowed to take off. And everyone was shouting and waving money around. It was insane. I remember sitting in the airport, trying to figure out what to do, watching the TV there, all about the emergency measures. And then my cell phone rings and I'm sorry, this is just, I know, your wife, I'm sorry. And my daughter, I'm really sorry. Thanks, Andy said. He remembered just for a moment, not sadness, which he'd had no time for back then, but simply how surreal everything was. How the president on TV calmly discussing the imminent end of civilization with the pandemic rash already on his face had seemed no more remarkable than the giant airplanes coming in to land outside. Neither had looked quite real. His wife must have lied to him, he thought. She must have lied. He repeated the same thought over and over, unable to focus well enough to finish with one idea and go on to the next. They just said on the news, 2 to 4 day survival from onset of definitive symptoms. And he talked with her that morning and she'd said she was fine. She and the kids were fine. She must have been lying. She tried to save his life, the last thing she did. And she'd failed because here he was in the middle of tens of thousands of probably contagious people, all for nothing. But he would not cry with Elzy. I couldn't help my wife and daughter, but my son was still out there. I didn't know where he was. The man who contacted me said my son was at our neighbor's house, but when I called, the phone just went to voicemail. Same thing with most of our other friends in the area. Most of them were probably sick already. Those few I could get a hold of had left town, so nobody could help me look for my boy. I tried the police, but they didn't seem to think a missing 8-year-old was an emergency. They thought I just couldn't find my babysitter's phone number or something. I couldn't explain it right. They were polite to me. I could have killed someone. I had to get back and look for him myself. But I couldn't get a permit to get through the roadblocks. I started looking for ways to smuggle myself through, but someone stole my supplies out of the back of my truck and I couldn't replace it all at once. They were rationing food and gas so people wouldn't drive across country. I hoarded what I needed a little at a time. Days went by, a week. Everything was ridiculously difficult. Things in Phoenix were falling apart. It's not that everybody was sick. Only a few dozen people were. No, the problem was fear. People mobbed stores, buying up face masks, vitamin C, duct tape as if that would help. They bought up hand sanitizer. That was just alcohol gel, though, and alcohol doesn't kill viruses, only bacteria. There were public dispensers for it all over the place anyway. People just weren't thinking. Anytime someone would show up on the street with what looked like the rash, even if it was just a sunburn, everybody would panic. And some looked for someone to blame. You said you thought the pandemic might have been deliberately created. So did we, but we didn't know who. So some people guessed. It was a government conspiracy. It was the Chinese. It was Arabs. It was white people. It was Mexicans. Mexicans? Oh, sure. There was a lot of tension because of the perceived competition for jobs between Anglos and Latinos, especially in the Southwest. And there were always people in this country who didn't like immigrants. Yeah, my mother told me that. Her parents brought her here when she was little, without papers. Go on. The most ridiculous thing I'd heard was that terrorists from Syria or Iran had invented the virus and were smuggling it into the United States inside infected, undocumented Mexican immigrants. Guys went out into the desert with guns. You know, it's funny. When I was your age, we were all obsessed with zombies. I don't know why. There were movies and books and stupid little games on the internet all about the zombie apocalypse. And then it actually happened. We were all the living dead running around in desperate need of brains. But I still thought I was going to get out. I was going to find some way through and go find my boy. Then I started coughing. On some level, I knew the pandemic wasn't a death sentence. Lots of people recovered. The real mortality was what happened later. But I wasn't thinking survival statistics. I was thinking, that's it. I failed. I'm dead. I wasn't going to make it to New Hampshire. Even with a car, the trip took almost a week. The hospitals were overloaded by then, and they couldn't do much for you anyway. So I got in my truck and headed north to the Grand Canyon to wait. I figured if I was going to die, I might as well do it somewhere pretty away from the crowds. But then my stupid truck broke down on the way. I was starting to feel really bad at that point, really sick. And I thought, well, this is great. Here I am about to die on the shoulder of the damn interstate. So I rigged up my tarp for shelter and privacy, crawled into the back of my truck, got in my sleeping bag, and waited. Everything hurt. I couldn't breathe well. But the worst thing, I was bored. I couldn't sleep or even daydream because of the pain, and because I was out of my head with fever. Time passed. I don't know how much. Then the fever broke. Breathing got a little easier. I sat up and it was like the fog had cleared. The virus was gone, but my lungs still felt awful. My truck still wouldn't start. My sleeping bag was soiled, just soaked. So I figured I was going to die of exposure. I had gotten myself cleaned up and dressed, and I was trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do when, I'm not kidding, 3 guys I know come riding up on horseback, and Andy suddenly realized that Elzy hadn't asked a question in a while. He listened to her silence and concluded that she was asleep. He tried not to feel slighted, but there was no way he was going to get to sleep himself. He hadn't thought about these things in a long time. How the desert smelled, the sounds of the riots in Phoenix, the cold, hard feeling of being sure he was about to die. And before that, how it felt not to be a widower. He'd forgotten that one. He felt all jazzed up, ready for battle, but there was no one to fight, nothing to do in this house of sleeping friends. He got up, went to the bathroom, and then walked down to the common room, sat in the dark at the empty bar, and turned on his tablet. He hadn't meant to share so much. He'd planned on telling Elzy about his experience of the pandemic, not himself, but the two had proved inseparable. He had not been able to stop the feelings coming up. And when Elzy somehow guessed or knew that his wife had died, he had been unable to deny it. He had managed to keep some things back, like the story of what happened to his parents and brother. But those thoughts and images, too, were all stirred up in his mind anyway. Should he have shared any of his story? He told himself that Elzy had needed to hear it, and would need to hear at least an edited version of the rest, that he was giving her what her parents couldn't or wouldn't. She had a right to know where her world came from. So what if there were things he'd rather not think of ever again? Her need trumped his. But he also scolded himself that he'd had no right to tell her, that she hadn't even really wanted to know, that she'd just been going through her stupid little kid routine for whatever reason, and he'd burdened her with his tale out of a selfish need for catharsis. Mostly he thought about nothing in particular at all, just waited for solitaire and the mindless, just waited for exhaustion and the mindless rhythm of computer solitaire to calm him. By the time he returned to his room, the moon, waning towards half, had risen high enough to shine in across the roofs of the buildings on the other side of the street and in at the window. Its light shone on Elzy, sleeping with her mouth open and her dark braids splayed out across the pillow. She looked very young. The moonlight reminded him of streetlights, the once ubiquitous sodium glow of another age, another house, another girl. He put out his hand to stroke the hair of the sleeping woman, but didn't complete the gesture. He put his hand away and went back to bed. Okay. I really didn't set out to write about a pandemic. I set out to write about what happens after the end of civilization. The pandemic was just the mechanism I needed to create the post-disaster world I wanted to write about. But if I'm going to do something, I want to do it right. I wanted epidemiologists to read my book and not, start twitching. So I read up on how infectious diseases spread and what health officials do about it. And I thoroughly picked the brain of a very generous virology student a friend of mine introduced me to. I created an imaginary disease and its sweep through humanity, and I made educated guesses about how humanity would respond. When life began to imitate art, it was eerie. Friends who had already read the book contacted me a bit freaked out, as though I'd predicted the future. I hadn't, of course. I'd simply listened to experts when they said what we were vulnerable to and what a disease likely to become a pandemic would be like. For example, we've seen how when there's an Ebola outbreak or a dangerous new flu strain or anything like that, health officials the world over are pretty quick to jump on it. When a new disease pops up in a rural area, which most of them do, they can usually get the outbreak contained pretty effectively because rural areas are isolated. For a new disease to pop up in a city is really rare, but those are the ones more likely to become pandemics because they're much harder to contain that way. Similarly, you might think the worst case scenario is Ebola or something like that because it has a really high mortality rate and its symptoms are just horrific. But actually, Ebola is not very contagious. And exactly because it's so awful, it's really easy to keep track of. You're not going to have an Ebola outbreak in your village and not notice. Far worse would be a highly contagious disease that sometimes has mild symptoms or none at all. It could spread under the radar and it would be impossible to contain. Even a relatively low mortality rate becomes catastrophic if enough people get sick, as we've seen. So I wrote about a respiratory disease that first appears in cities and becomes contagious before symptoms start. COVID has pretty much the same profile, but of course it does. It had to. The next pandemic would by definition. The fictional disease does have a higher mortality rate than COVID does, but what makes it in civilization is that it's far more contagious. The real problem ends up being that basically everybody in the whole world gets sick at the same time. Talk about supply chain problems. Having spent a couple of years imagining catastrophe, I might have let myself get really freaked out by the real pandemic, except I knew what a disease had to have to pose an existential threat. And COVID, bad as it is, it's not quite as transmissible as it could have been. It really wasn't a threat on that level. There are advantages to being a stickler for realism. And one of them is that you stay a bit more grounded when life imitates art. Creating a plausible fictional pandemic was one thing. Figuring out how society would respond was something else. And there, the experts couldn't help me. After all, very few living people had ever seen anything remotely similar. Yeah, I'm talking about the 1918 flu. That was really the previous comparable. It's weird to think about it, but when I was writing this book, like 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't know. We didn't know what any of this would be like. So I guess correctly about increased xenophobia and blaming. I guess correctly, that there would be panic buying, although I thought it would be duct tape, not toilet paper that flew off the shelves. There were other things I got right too. But I overestimated the tendency to riot. I missed the way people would pull together. I completely missed social distancing. And although the fictional disease, like the real one, is worse for people with underlying health problems and not good access to medical care, I didn't think about how that would translate into racial disparities. I should have. I was naive. I probably still am. So I started writing with a couple of goals in mind. But the story really evolved as I wrote it and became other things. One of my original goals, and I did this, was to explore science the way scientists experience it, not as some exotic thing, but just as normal. The normal thing that you and your friends talk about because it's the thing you have in common. But I knew that most of my readers wouldn't be scientists. So how do I make something feel normal to people it's not normal to? Part of my solution was to have Andy and Elzy use their shared frame of reference, ecology, to talk about something that would be familiar to readers, human interaction. Let me find you an example to read. Page 104 is just queuing things up electronically is harder. Here we go. What? No, I'm sorry, the pagination on the electronic copy is different. So I'm going to have to find it. Something like the old-fashioned way. It's a new-fashioned way. If it was the old-fashioned way, it would be faster. How do you like this? I'm reading a book set in the future and I'm having problems because I'm reading it off of a computer. Shouldn't work that way. I read that something similar happened with Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner were interviewing each other for something, and they had a tape recorder to interview, and they couldn't get the tape recorder to work. And they were sitting there, you know, like, we're famous for playing Kirk and Spock, and we can't get our tape recorder to work. What the heck? This is just, I'm sorry, this should not be taking this long.
If it's helpful, looking in our book, page 104 is just a few pages before it becomes chapter 5, if that helps on your computer. You had mentioned page 104.
It does. See, they have Oh, I see what the problem is. The problem is that the computer copy counts 2 pages at a time as one computer page. So here we go. I found it. Okay, found it. If this were a movie, she said in a dreamy voice, you'd turn out to actually be my real father. She was lying on her belly, chin in hand, kicking her feet idly. She was being 10 again. Andy looked up from his book for a moment. I think I'd know, he said dryly. Elzy was about to point out that, being a man, he might not. A man could father a child and not know. When she realized what such a comment would imply about his character, she shut her mouth. I'd also know, he added, as though he could read her mind, if there was a possibility I might not know. Elsie's face reddened and she looked away. She would not apologize for thinking, no matter how embarrassing the thought. Anyway, she hadn't meant that Andy was her dad, only that in a movie he would be, because movies are like that. He wasn't even her father figure, not exactly. She didn't know what Andy was to her or what she was to him. She didn't even know for sure if she was important to him at all. The silence stretched out for a while. I have some articles on insect host plant choices, Andy said finally, if you want me to send them to you too. Sure. Somehow she had started to specialize in insects and how they interacted with human communities. She was researching now for a series of more in-depth workshops on this subject. You know, Andy began conversationally, there is, or at least used to be, a community of urban butterflies in the Northwest that aren't using any of the remaining native plants there. They're completely dependent on exotics in people's gardens. It's what's called a novel ecosystem, species that didn't evolve together but form a functional community anyway. If you got everybody to grub up those exotics and replant with natives, what would happen to those butterflies? Elzy happened to be facing away from him as he spoke, so she allowed herself to roll her eyes fondly. In her workshop, she stated authoritatively that non-native plants are inedible to insects and so starve insect-eating birds, that living things need their evolutionary partners, the species they have grown up with, so to speak, to survive. So naturally, Andy had found a counterexample. He liked to do that. Questions interested him far more than certainty. She made an interested noise. Relationships between organisms that do not share evolutionary history might not be as nuanced or specialized, he continued, addressing the back of her head, but sometimes they are enough. Elzy turned to face him, surprised, but his expression was unreadable. Something inside her had softened at his words, but she wasn't sure whether it should have. Everything he said could be understood on more than one level, and she never knew which level he actually meant, and couldn't imagine asking. Out of conversations like that, though, evolved what became one of the unexpected central themes of the book. I'm going to read you the scene where this happens, where this new theme introduced itself to me, because I did not know it was going to. Hopefully I'll find this one faster. Page 214 is where it's supposed to be. Let's see. Is this it? Okay, close. Got it. Yay! Just a word of explanation. In this scene, Andy and Elzy are on a river ferry, and they're having lunch. It is good, Andy pronounced. Does it actually taste like fried oysters? Sort of, Elzy replied, a little. You've never had oysters? No. He obviously thought the answer self-evident. Have you ever broken Jewish dietary laws? I break some of them often, but the laws I do follow, I haven't broken them since I rode east the first time. Why not? Why follow some laws and not others? I don't know. You like my mother, Elzy commented and took a bite of her roll. Excuse me? You're religious the same way. She says I was christened and she crosses herself sometimes. But she didn't object when I didn't want to be confirmed. She only goes to Mass on Christmas and Easter. I don't think she prays anymore. So she's like you. She's religious out of habit. Andy leaned back and folded his arms over his chest. In my case, it's a little more than that, he said after a pause. I'm Jewish because my mother was Jewish. She was because of her parents. One of my grandfathers had the numbers, on his arm. If I assimilate, if I start thinking and acting like everybody else, then for what did they survive? Why did they come to America if not for me to be able to live here as a Jew? And he went back to eating his roll. The boat started moving again with a small jolt. Elzy exhaled, blowing the hair out of her face. She was used to the shadow of the pandemic, but this? She'd read about the Holocaust in books. She'd never thought to find its legacy sitting across the table from her sharing a basket of fries. Your family has been through 2 tragedies then, she said. I hadn't thought of that. Everybody goes through something. It's like hurricanes, she said after some thought. Oh, yeah. The Great September Gale, the hurricane of 1938, Tropical Storm Irene, Hurricane Odette. You've told me how to find sign from all of them. But those scars don't mar the landscape, do they? They create it. What you're talking about is disturbance history, Andy told her. Say, fire. People look at a wildfire, they think it's the end of the world. As he spoke, he noticed he had a blob of ketchup on the back of his left hand. It looked almost like blood. He put down his roll and used his ketchuped hand as a sort of a palette, daubing a violent spot into the middle of the table with his right index finger. And it is the end of the world, he said, if your world happens to be encompassed by the particular patch that burned. Animals and plants die in fire. Sometimes people do. That loss is very real, but it is local in both place and time. If you pull back, if you look at the bigger scale, you'll see there's lots of little burn patches in various stages of recovery. He began dotting the table with lots of little ketchup blobs. Pull back far enough, and you'll see that the fires are just part of a larger complex pattern, like the logged patches in the mountains, if you remember. He surveyed his work, and Elzy laughed to see it. He'd made a rather crooked and pointless smiley face. I wrote that, the way I wrote that, it appeared in my mind and I simply wrote it down like I was copying from a movie or something. That's how my process works sometimes. And then I read what I'd written and okay, now I have to rewrite the first part of the book. So it matches that because this is it. There's this line, if you caught it. And it is the end of the world if your world is the patch that burned. The loss is very real. The larger pattern he describes doesn't make tragedy not tragic. He knows better than that. He lost family members to the pandemic. His grandfather lost family to the Holocaust. There's no planet on which things like that are just not awful. But he's an ecologist, and the idea of apparent contradiction between scales is a very important part of some forms of ecology. The idea is what's going on at a small scale can seem the exact opposite of what's going on at a large scale, and yet they're both real, and in fact, they're both interacting with each other. We're not using an analogy here. We're not saying, let's pretend human beings are ecosystems. No. Rather, the discipline of ecology provides a certain perspective on how systems in general work. Ecosystems are systems, but so are human societies and even human minds. So studying ecology gives you a way of thinking about all sorts of things beyond ecology. And maybe that kind of perspective helps Andy to cope. Okay, we are migrating into the other room so I can plug in.
I'm gonna I might have to stop us soon because my library closes in about 10 minutes.
I think I can. I think I've got it.
Okay.
Maybe that kind of perspective can help Andy to cope. It can help other people too. I'm not saying everybody needs to go study ecology. I'm just saying that Andy's source of perspective and comfort is another example of something I covered in fiction that ends up applying in real life too. I know because right after I published Ecological Memory, my sister died. She didn't have COVID, she had cancer. But the point is, there's no planet on which her death or anyone's death is anything other than awful. Knowing there's a larger world, a larger pattern, doesn't take that away. But being able to regard both scales as equally and wholly real does make the scale that hurts a little bit easier to deal with. Now, usually there's another selection that I would read to sort of end on a lighter note than that. But we're running short on time, and I do want to, have some time for questions. Also, I want to say, if you read my book and like it, which I trust that you will, please, 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 please go on Amazon and write me a review. It doesn't have to be something you publish in the New York Times. I liked it and a couple of stars, that's fine. The thing is that Amazon's algorithm is friendlier to books that have more reviews. And so more people will find out my book exists and get to decide whether they want to read it or not if I get reviews. So please, 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 please. Good. So anybody have any questions? And this is being recorded, so ask questions for the people who aren't watching too.
Not a question, just I'm just, and I'm sure you've heard this. I'm just amazed at how you wrote it just before an actual pandemic happened. And again, I'm sure everybody else has said the same exact thing to you. When the pandemic, when it first started, were you thinking like, I just wrote this?
Well, when it first started, I was a little bit more focused on like, okay, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
But yeah, the irony didn't escape me. Actually, there's if I can tell the story briefly. If you see the movie 2001, there's a scene in it where you can see the Earth from the moon. And it's a weird looking scene because we know that the Earth doesn't look like that from the moon. Because we've seen pictures, and there are human beings who are still alive who've actually looked up in the lunar sky and seen it. Of course, the movie came out before that happened. By a couple of months, you had this beautiful science fiction movie set in, what was then the future, and a fairly believable future. And they would have had decades in which it was still believable that, yes, this movie is about our future, but within a couple of months, some big news story happened, and now everybody knows what the Earth looks like from the moon, and that scene is wrong, and it's now obvious that the movie is just fiction. And I knew that story, and I thought, I'm going to work very hard so that doesn't happen to me. And I pulled all of these tricks and set up all of these things to kind of insulate myself. And it happened. It happened. Me and Stanley Kubrick,
That's right.
happened to both of us.
Well, you did it. It was a wonderful job. So thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we thank you. We thank you for this book too. It certainly was very different from anything I've ever read. And I had to go back at least twice and check and make sure, because this book only came to our library in January of 22.
Mhm.
So I looked at least twice. When did she write this book? Because it was just, I was wondering if you were taking from what was going on, obviously, because so much of it was. But I think I noticed the distance. There wasn't. There was no reference to, our distancing ourselves during the pandemic, which is social distancing, whatever the proper term is. But, it's still very real. I mean, at least in my community and where we are and the people that we deal with, we're still, if, unless it's your immediate family, you know exactly where everybody is, so. But this is quite the book, and I thank you very much for your time to talk about it, and I certainly will go on Amazon and give it a good review. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank you for the compliment, but there's actually a sad piece with that I was able to do that. As I said in the talk, the reason I was able to write about a pandemic that ended up quite realistic in certain respects, not others, was that there are experts who knew this would happen. And they weren't keeping it secret. I mean, I don't have security clearances. I just, anybody could find this out. This has been an entirely predictable disaster. And, I'm not going to get into politics or anything, but, predictable disasters shouldn't happen.
Agreed.
So it's really sad the way that played out, and it's not, yeah.
Yeah, it's not over either.
No, it's not. And the scary thing is it could get worse.
Yeah.
Every so often a new strain will come out and they'll say, this one's as contagious as measles. And so far, none of them have been, which is good. But whenever I hear that, see, I know what that means, because I've done the research for this book. So that scares me every time I hear it. Supply chain problems scare me because I've done the research for this.
Well, it's a wonderful book. So.
Thank you.
So thank you very, very much for this program. And thank you, Terry and Rich, for being here. And we look forward to hearing more from you.
I'm working on a sequel.
Excellent.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
And thank you for putting up with my various technical problems and my being.
Oh, no problem.
No problem. No problem.
Not at all. No, we're happy to be here.
Yep. Glad to hear from you.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Terry and Rich, and hope everyone has a good evening.
Yep, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye, everybody.